perhaps Trump is not, is actually, not such an idiot as Putin believes him to be, and that as we also know, Trump is highly sensitive to personal slights. If he thinks that Putin is playing him for a fool, he could actually be as irrationally, turn into being as irrationally anti-Putin as he's been irrationally pro-Putin. And interestingly, actually, I think that's something that the Russians realize much better than the Americans or the Europeans. People forget that Trump was much harsher on Putin than Obama ever was, by the way. The Russians remember that actually they thought that Trump was their guy, and Trump turned out not to be their guy.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Owen Matthews, a writer, historian and associate editor for The Spectator. Owen is also the former Moscow bureau chief for Newsweek. Owen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
President Putin has called for this 3-day ceasefire coinciding with Russia's Victory Day celebrations. His recent Easter ceasefire seemed to be a bit of a facade. Is there any sign people, Ukraine, Kiev, the US, believe this one's going to work?
There's no way of knowing. It may work, it may not work. But actually, the important thing about the ceasefire is not actually what happens on the ground, but what it means for Putin's big game diplomatically. And I think one thing is really very clear, and has been clear since the beginning of the Trump presidency, is that Putin is just sort of playing this grand game of sort of diplomatic prestidigitation, sort of conjuring one thing. His main aim is to pretend that he is pushing for peace. And the ceasefire is significant pretty much only in that sense, is that it's like part of his fugazi, of saying that, well, I'm willing to talk, I'm willing to be the peacemaker, and in fact, I think his aim, although it's very hard to diagnose what Putin's aims really are, but I think it's pretty clear that if the talks do break down, he wants to lay the blame squarely at Ukraine's door. But in fact, what the significant thing today actually was not the ceasefire. It was actually the fact that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, came out with a set of Russia's official demands for the end of the war. And surprise, surprise, those were exactly, meet the new demands, same as the old demands. They hadn't shifted basically not even by a fraction of an inch. So while the world has been following Trump and Zelensky, and while they've all been, while we've all been, following what the Americans have supposedly been putting to the Europeans, what the Americans have been putting to Zelensky, we kind of lost touch with what the actual Russians are saying. And guess what? The Russians' position is actually very different from the Americans' position. And we should kind of bear that in mind when we dump on Trump, as I think we rightly can criticize Trump for accepting Russian talking points. Because when you look at the actual Russian talking points, those are just, crazy, even compared to the Trump ones. So, we've been debating, should Zelensky accept the formal recognition of Crimea as lost territory? That's what the Americans are demanding. Guess what? The Russians are demanding that Ukraine recognize all the territory and also give the Russians some more territory, which they haven't even captured yet. So actually, when you're looking at what does this mean? What's the meaning of the ceasefire? It doesn't really matter whether Putin is stopped shooting or not. What matters is that this ceasefire is like a cover for just basically coming out with slab-faced, as Lavrov does so well, that sort of Soviet bureaucrat act of his, and saying guess what? These are our demands, and you can lump it if you don't accept them.
And I do want to come on to that interview that Lavrov gave, I believe, to a Brazilian newspaper. But in the first instance, we have seen something of a reaction from the White House. they've reiterated their position that they want a permanent ceasefire. It may well have. It seems like it's almost fallen on deaf ears to an extent. This proposal. Carolyn Levitt has even said that Trump is getting frustrated with Putin. Are we at least starting to see that Putin-Trump kind of honeymoon period almost at the start of Trump's presidency fraying a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is that actually, um, um, basically the sort of the frequency of those kind of growls of irritation is starting to are starting to increase. I mean, the first time we actually heard Trump um, really criticize Putin, it was back on the 30th of March, actually, when that was the first time he said, "I'm going to come out with secondary sanctions, and I'm going to get medieval on Putin's backside," or words to that effect. And that was a month ago, and now we're seeing it more and more back. On Saturday, just after Trump met Zelensky in the Vatican, he, caps locked, Vladimir, stop it. When there was another one of these sort of horrific or egregious attacks on civilians by Russian missiles. And again today, Trump was asked, do you trust Putin? And he said, well, I'll let you know in 2 weeks, which is, I mean, you never really know with Trump, because he can at times be wildly inconsistent. But maybe we're looking at a moment of truth coming up. And Putin again, Trump again talked about secondary sanctions and banking sanctions today. And it's worth considering for a moment what that actually means, because Trump sort of throws this out a lot, secondary sanctions. The truth is that although we think that Europe and the US has sanctioned Russia up the wazoo, there's 600 sanctions. Actually, the thing that really matters for Russia is the ability to export oil and gas. That has not, in fact, been sanctioned, crazily. It's just and in fact in 2024, although at the end of last year, on the 1st of January this year, a major pipeline which traversed Ukraine, that was bringing Russian gas via Ukraine into Europe, crazily, was closed only on January the 1st this year. In 2024, Europe actually increased its imports of Russian liquefied natural gas by 25%. So that's crazy, making Russia the second biggest supplier to the EU of liquefied natural gas, LNG. America could, if it really wanted to, apply its enormous fiscal and regulatory and financial pressure to customers of Russian oil, like China, like India. If they wanted to go down that route and accept the consequences of essentially starting a sort of trade war, sanctions war against the main customers of Russia's energy, China, Russia, and the EU, by the way, then if he wants to do that, then actually he does have the power to cut Putin's war economy off at the knees. He really could inflict very serious damage to Putin's war economy. Putin is banking that he's not going to do that. That Trump's not going to do that. It's going to be too expensive for him, politically and economically. And he's also banking that, I believe that Putin thinks that he's kind of got the measure of Donald Trump. He thinks that what Trump is interested in is the bottom line, the big bucks, and all this stuff. And to be honest, maybe he's not wrong, because Trump has actually given us quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the big deal, and joint business projects with Russia is what he's interested in. And as recently as 20th of April, just 8 days ago, we had another lapidary, all caps message from the Donald, where he said, let's get this deal done, so Ukraine and Russia can both do business with big business with the United States and make us all rich, hooray, all caps. So and I think but the question is, Is Putin right about that? Is it true that, like, sort of, you know, that Big Donny is just interested in the cash, which is what the Kremlin clearly thinks? I don't. Perhaps Trump is not. Is actually, not such an idiot as Putin believes him to be, and that as we also know, Trump is highly sensitive to personal slights. If he thinks that Putin is playing him for a fool, he could actually be as irrationally, turn into being as irrationally anti-Putin, as he's been irrationally pro-Putin. And interestingly, actually, I think that's something that the Russians realize much better than the Americans or the Europeans, because I think the Europeans are sort of pretty much united in shock and horror and indignation and, disgust of, at Trump and at his, going over apparently to the Russian side in these negotiations. But I think the Russians themselves are not nearly as complacent about about their victory, and about Trump being on their side as many Americans and Europeans are, because Russians have got a slightly longer memory, and they remember Trump won. And although you have various sort of, infantile, poorly informed commentators in the British press claiming that Trump is a sort of a Russian agent, he's works for Putin, and there's clearly blackmail, all this sort of all this nonsense. Actually, people forget that Trump was much harsher on Putin than Obama ever was, by the way. It was actually Trump that sanctioned Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He didn't actually succeed in completely shutting it down, but it was Trump that sent lethal weaponry to Ukraine, and Obama did not. So actually, despite all those sort of famous atmospherics in Helsinki, Trump and Putin, and after the Helsinki meeting, famously in 2017, Trump appeared to believe in Putin's word over that of his own intelligence services. I mean, this is all ancient news now, but the Russians remember that actually they thought that Trump was their guy, and Trump turned out not to be their guy.
And I want to come back to those comments we discussed briefly there about the comments from Russia's foreign minister Lavrov. Is this a kind of usual tactic that we see from the Russians, where someone in the Russian group, be that Dmitriev perhaps, who's dealing more with the Americans, will put forward an idea like Putin has today? Oh, we're going to do a ceasefire. And then you suddenly and quite quickly see someone else come forward, like Lavrov in this case, and go, oh, actually, we want to go back to our original demands. I mean, is that quite a regular thing that the Russians do? And are they willing to just rinse and repeat on that until they really do feel some pushback from Trump?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. That is the Russian strategy. It's a sort of scattergun approach. Give with the left hand, take with the right hand, and essentially it's kind of a it's of a piece with Putin's whole career, actually, which is that he's a sort of great tactician, but he's not a good strategist. And his, what he's always been really good at is sort of playing tactical situations for, for full advantage, and sort of he did that very successfully right up until his catastrophic miscalculation back in February of 2022, when I think he massively overreached. He launched a war that Putin believed was basically a sort of massively aggravated putsch, a sort of regime change operation that he thought would take 3 days. Putin didn't launch this war thinking that it was going to take 3.5 plus years and claim 1 million casualties and so on. That was not the war that Putin wanted to fight. He went to war for the same reason that most dictators go to war, because he thought he could win it easily, and he was mistaken about that. And I think right now, the key debate is, does Putin want peace? But I think that's kind of perhaps the wrong question. Putin just wants to wants whatever he can get away with, and right now, rationally, you and I might think, looking at sort of what our understanding of Putin's hand to be, we would think, Vlad, take bank the win. An amazing thing has, fate has just suddenly sort of dealt you a hand, which includes the completely unexpected, wholehearted support of the United States, of the President of the United States. Like, that's a fantastic moment to, to cash out. But the big problem is now, and just as it was back in 2022, is that we don't know what Putin knows. We don't know what information gets into his little information bubble. And what might seem rational to us is, we don't know what he's being told about his military capabilities. We don't know about what the actual situation is in his in his economy. There are actually lots of reasons for that an end to the war is actually quite a dangerous thing for him, because it means that he has to deal with returning soldiers. He has gigantic spike in unemployment. These are unpredictable, ultra-nationalist, armed people. I mean, it's problematic to end the war as well as problematic to continue fighting the war as well. But the real issue is, I think that he doesn't really have a strategy except to try and get as much as possible out of his opponents and out of their and out of the discord between the United States and Europe as he possibly can. And to that end, indeed, his strategy and his tactics are basically to sort of try and sort of two-track good cop and bad cop at the same time.
And Lavrov also said in those comments, he's said that the ball's not in our court. Kiev needs to act first. He did mention that Kiev do have that moratorium on talks in place. I mean, is that just Russia trying to put the blame back on Ukraine? Or should we actually watch out for that moratorium being lifted by Kiev as a sign that negotiations, direct talks between Russia and Kiev could be imminent?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a crazy thing that Kiev literally passed a law, banning any negotiations with the Putin regime. I mean, it's kind of childish, actually. I mean, I can understand why they did it, but it's not really a serious political decision. It's like an emotional decision. It's a statement, and legislation should not really be driven by emotion. But I think the more productive question is, what could possibly be a positive outcome of direct negotiations between Kiev and Moscow. I mean, that how is that going to work out? It's definitely not going to work out, because there's so much horror, there's so much hatred, there's so much passion. There is absolutely no way that any Kiev official interlocutor could possibly actually have a discussion that even entertain the kind of things that Russia is demanding. And among the things that Russia is demanding, by the way, is restrictions on the size of Ukraine's army, and what they describe as denazification, which is sort of an easing of restrictions on Russian language rights and so on. Which is, in fact, by the way, the only point on which both the European Union and the Russian Federation agree, because the European Union also regards Ukraine's language laws as basically illegal and violating European norms on the rights of minority languages. But anyway, let's park that for a second. Maybe there will be eventually talks between Kiev and Moscow, but they're not going to get to peace, unfortunately. I think the best chance is for a deal to be done over the heads of the Ukrainians. And that sounds like a sort of really ugly thing, and it's definitely a violation of what the West and the Biden administration told and promised the Ukrainians, like there will be no deal without Ukrainian buy-in. But actually, with over the heads of the Ukrainians, but actually that's precisely what the Biden administration was planning to do too. So in that sense, actually, the sort of bare bones of the deal that Trump has been proposing, in other words, no NATO and de facto partition of Ukraine, that those two things will be the basis of a ceasefire have been kind of devastatingly obvious for a couple of years now, and that's also the deal that I think a Biden or Harris administration would have done just as much as Trump has done it. So that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is that the Trump administration has apparently backed like all the sort of the extra stuff, like sort of the formal judicial recognition of Crimea. I mean, that's really extraordinary, and the extraordinary spectacle of a U.S. administration essentially sort of doing the bidding of a authoritarian dictator or authoritarian leader to redraw an international boundary by right of conquest. That's pretty extraordinary that the United States should be backing that kind of thing. That's the surprising part. It's not the partition part. I mean, there are lots of examples in the history of the relatively modern history of the world. Korea being one of them, Cyprus being another, of countries being divided after conflict, but neither side actually recognizing the other, but nonetheless kind of sort of legal fictions being established, and sort of everyone gets on with their lives, and the killing stops. So, but that's not what Russia's asking for. Russia's not asking for a sort of fudge or compromise. According to Lavrov, at least, they're actually demanding full recognition of all the territory they occupy. And it's a massive over ask as well. I mean, it's a negotiating position, but who knows where they're going to get to. But if even the United States has no compellent strategy, or doesn't want to use anything, or doesn't want to do anything to actually compel Russia to sign, what hope is there for Ukraine having any compellent strategy? They got nothing.
And is there a sign in that at all, this kind of back and forth on whether or not Putin seems to want any kind of ceasefire? Is there a sign in that there is a level of division somewhere in Russia, or at least Putin trying to juggle the expectations of these kind of two sides that have emerged, of the nationalists who have always been a lot more hawkish in this conflict versus those kind of more Western acclimated oligarchs who are more focused on the idea of getting rid of the sanctions?
It's again sort of like as Churchill described Russian politics. It's like some dogs fighting under the carpet. Who knows where these groups stand? The entirety of the Russian elite, and that's including people who are close to Putin, and so the securocrats who are Russia's true oligarchs. Russian businessmen are not oligarchs in any way, in any true sense. They just happen to be rich men, but they don't really have any influence on Putin. But this is the sort of senior securocrats who are the sort of bureaucrat billionaires who are around. I mean, all of them materially, stand to gain enormously for the lifting of sanctions. And the full lifting of sanctions is, by the way, one of the demands on the very hardcore Lavrov list. But I think ultimately it's really clear that the people at the very top of the pyramid, in other words, Putin himself and the people that surround him, like FSB chief Alexander Bortnikov and his advisor, former Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, and all these sort of old KGB dinosaurs that have literally been sort of mates of Putin from the KGB since the 70s. They've literally been working together for half a century. I think their priority is absolutely that of national security, and they actually are willing to sacrifice pretty much on almost anything, certainly anything material, to fulfill those what they see as the defense of the motherland against NATO encroachment and aggression, and also to unite, gather Russian peoples, like the Russian peoples of Ukraine that were unfairly cut off from their motherland. That's their concept. So I think that those people definitely have the upper hand, and whatever debate there may be within the Russian elite, it's the securocrats that have the whip hand, and they really don't care about the money.
And in your recent article for The Spectator, you talk about Trump's idea of this kind of peace through profit. It's what you mentioned in that Truth Social post you put out earlier, that let's do big deals, everyone can be rich. is there actually anything the US would buy off Russia anyway? I mean, certainly, surely it wouldn't be
That's
oil.
that's a really good question. Well, I think, um, well, if you look at what Kirill Dmitriev is proposing, Kirill Dmitriev is a really interesting guy. He grew up in California from the age of 14. Went to Harvard and Stanford, and he was at Goldman Sachs and at McKinsey. He's like, he's basically an American banker, but like he's actually Russian, and for the last decade he's run the sovereign wealth fund. So he's like the Putin administration's kind of secret weapon. He's like the sort of their guy who speaks American, and thinks American sort of. And what Dmitriev has been proposing has been sort of a carve up of the sort of resources of the high Arctic. So from the northeast passage, which will cut about 30, which is opening up thanks to global warming. Global warming is fantastic news for Russia, by the way. Uh, it's opening up ice-free navigation through over the top of Russia, which saves the 30% on time and fuel for Asia, European, Asia, American shipping, and oil resources. There's the world's largest untapped gas field. It's called Stockman. It's also up there. So all of this is like perfect for political purposes because it's like the numbers are enormous, and it's also like reassuringly unverifiable. And it's never going to happen on their timeline. It's not going to happen like this year or even in 5 years. It's something you can talk about and come away with as a great gigantic big fat deal, but actually no one's actually going to. It's not going to happen without billions of dollars being invested and years passing.
And just to finish, Owen, what could Trump do right now if he does have one of his admittedly quite characteristic turns against Putin on the economy, but also militarily, if he wanted to push Putin around? And is there any role left for Europe in that?
Yeah, well, actually, unfortunately, the Biden administration, rather stupidly, and in my opinion, sort of took a really important bargaining chip out of Trump's hands because they're in rather precipitously allowing the Ukrainians to use medium range, or in fact they're short range, but ATACMS rockets, like up to 300 kilometers. Is still technically speaking a short range rocket, but anyway, to attack targets inside Russia. Now that could have been a really important piece of escalation that Trump could have held over Russia, but the Biden administration sort of just caved and gave that to the Ukrainians back in November, and they actually sort of ended up not doing very much with it. But militarily, yeah, I mean, actually, there is a lot that of very damaging and dangerous equipment and rocketry that the Americans could supply, but at the same time, I think there's actually kind of good reasons for not doing that because actually the risk of triggering a sort of direct war between America and Russia is not zero. So actually, that's kind of military options are quite dangerously escalatory. And Trump has not mentioned those. He's so far been talking about banking sanctions and economic sanctions, but those can also be very damaging to the Russian economy too, if Trump decides that he's willing to pay the political and economic price for using those.
And is there any role left for Europe in any of this? Is there any pressure they can apply anymore? This idea of the reassurance force, for example?
No. That's a ridiculous non-starter. I can't even believe anyone's wasting breath on that completely nonsensical idea, because that's a non-starter. There's no way that Russia will. There's no way that Russia will agree to it, and maybe if we had a means to compel Russia to agree with it, then we could just give no damns about their disagreement. But since we don't, then have a way of forcing Russia to do what we impose on them, then we actually have to take their veto as serious. No, obviously, no reassurance, of course, but that doesn't mean that Europe doesn't have a role. Europe does have a huge role. Is that they're going to have they're going to have to pick up the bill of at least $50 billion euros to keep to keep Ukraine in weapons and to restore Ukraine's armed forces, and then even more to actually restore Ukraine's broken infrastructure and sort of shattered society.
Owen Matthews, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for membership at the link below or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.